is pressure?
So one way you can think about pressure, force. It's like it's force being applied, right? But there's perception of pressure. So this is the thing. Like in a physical world, right? Like if you have to lift a weight, it's an objective kind of force being applied. Like if someone drops a weight on you and you've got to kind of push it, right? That's pretty objective. And really, the degree to which you're going to experience that is going to be based on how strong you are. Like if you're quite strong, if it's not very heavy, you're not going to feel like too much pressure. But if someone keeps adding more weight, it's going to feel harder and harder. And like that's kind of what we're talking about. That's how I sort of make sense of pressure. But I think in the more kind of practical day to day, it's often to do with, there's a kind of your perception is that there's being like a force applied, but then it's often it's really about how you actually perceive your ability to respond to it. And that's the thing. And some of that's going to be sort of real, and some of that's going to be likely imagined, if that makes sense. So, if I'm given like a work deadline and it's a piece of work that I know pretty well, and I've got a good sense of how long it takes me to do that, and then I go, but I've just not got enough time to do it. If the outcome is important to me, like if I go, God, I'm going to drop the ball on that, I'm not going to get this across the line, consequences are going to be a big deal, you'll probably experience that as quite a bit of pressure. Right? So this is the perception piece. It's like, does it matter to you? Do you feel able to cope with what's coming your way? And I think that's where the psychology piece can come in, especially as it kind of goes to more like social pressure. Because again, a lot of those kind of outcomes, it's almost like, so if a friend asks me to do something and I don't want to do it, the piece is like, well, if I say no, what are the consequences? Right? Is it really that big a deal or not? Like, is this going to end the relationship, or are they going to be a bit miffed and then they get over it? So I think that's the kind of piece for a lot of stuff. It's really understanding is the how I'm perceiving it, like the outcome of it not being able to do it, is that actually quite negative, or is it not so bad?
That's good.
Does that make some sense?
It makes great sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it works across peer pressure and social pressure and I suppose societal norms.
Yeah.
They're a form of pressure in themselves.
Yeah.
I should behave a certain way in this situation, but I don't feel like I know how to do that, so therefore I'm nervous about this situation.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that's, I suppose, what pressure is. What is the effect that it has?
So again, if we're feeling that kind of force, if we're feeling it's exceeding our ability to cope, and likely if we're, on some level, whether it's not even that conscious, we're concerned about the outcome, that will then tend to turn into stress, the experience of stress, right? So when we talk about stress, another word for the pressure is we use stressor. So in the psychology world, they talk about the stressor. That is the thing in the environment that is applying the stress to you, like the strain, the pressure. And then actually, if that exceeds your sort of perception of ability to cope, you'll have a stress response. Right? So you've got the stressor, and then you have the stress response to the stressor. I might have a stressor, but if it's well within my sort of perception, my ability to cope with it, it's probably not going to cause me very much stress. Right? So it's like if I said to somebody, do you think you could phone someone? Ask them a question, and people are going to go, yeah, I could probably do that. I go, right, so what size is that stressor? And it's like, not big at all. Right? So the stress response is minimal. If someone's going, right, okay, do you think you could speak in front of 100 people tomorrow? I'm going to give you the topic now, so you've got like tonight to plan for it. Right? Oh, and they're your work colleagues. Right? Suddenly it's like, oh crap, okay, so if it doesn't go so well, I'm going to be perceived in a particular way, is there reputational damage, what might be going on? You'd say like that's a high stressor, and that will then likely cause the stress response in us. Okay? So the stress response really is your body's physiological reaction to a perception of threat or challenge. Right? And by challenge, it's just anything that you feel is kind of really getting you to that kind of limit or sort of exceeding your sort of ability to be able to cope. Yeah? And from the physiological point of view, what people often notice is that's when sort of the autonomic nervous system gets involved. It's the kind of the automatic nervous system that regulates, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, digestive functions, all that kind of stuff. It kind of works happily in the background. In response to stress, essentially that activates. And so what you'll tend to notice is you'll probably get like a little bit of an increase in heart rate, likely increase in blood pressure, breathing might increase a little bit. You'll get probably like an increase in muscle tension, things like that. Again, we're evolved to have this in sort of short bursts. We had this, people talk about the kind of fight or flight response. It's more actually fight is the preference for most people. Get away if I can. If I can't get away, then I'll fight. So that's the sort of thing that people often notice. And ideally what happens is once you've navigated your way through that challenge, the autonomic nervous system will essentially slow itself down again. So you essentially get like a reduction in blood pressure, heart rate will slow, breathing will slow, you'll probably start to feel more relaxed.
And how does that stress response affect the way that we think?
Right, so if stress gets too high, so there's a kind of you'll find this for a bit of an optimum for people. So a little bit of that kind of stress will usually get us fired up. So you get the kind of these stress hormones in your system. People talk about being like adrenalized, got adrenaline in me. What that will usually do is we'll kind of speed things up. So you'll probably start to think a bit quicker. You'll probably be able to kind of move a bit quicker. It'll probably benefit you so long as it doesn't go too high. When it passes a threshold, it's almost like the opposite starts to happen. So your mind might get a bit too racy, concentration, you'll probably struggle to concentrate. Some people will get kind of jumpy thoughts. It just makes it quite tricky. When it gets really bad, like the frontal part of your brain, which does all the kind of higher order thinking, pretty much goes offline. And that's the kind of headless chicken phenomenon you get with some people, right? They literally just, and it's not their fault, it's like their higher reasoning center is essentially like switched off. Right? And so ideally what you want to then do is you want to try and modulate the stress response, and that's something that's really important for people to kind of recognize, that we actually have the tools within us to stay on top of our stress response. That's something a lot of people don't realize. A lot of people are aware of feeling stressed, but they're not always so aware of the fact that they can actually bring it down themselves. And what a lot of us tend to do is we use external kind of tools to manage our stress, right? So someone might, watch Netflix, right? They just I'll just watch something to kind of tune out. They might have like a hot bath. They might go for a walk. They might go for a run. They might go to the gym. They might hang out with friends. Some people will, use substances. You turn to alcohol, whatever it might be, to sort of take that edge off. And in proportional ways, like these are not a problem. Like there are ways to kind of to do that. But I think it's also important to recognize we have internal tools that we can rely on. So the internal tool, for example, is actually improving your bodily awareness so that you can actually check in with yourself and sort of self-monitor what's happening physiologically. So do I recognize if my breathing's got quite rapid? Can I tell that actually I'm breathing quite high up? Right? Which is more what we do when we're feeling stressed. When we're more relaxed, we tend to breathe more from the diaphragm, things like that. So am I aware of that? Do I notice that my heart is kind of going quite quick? Boom, 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 boom. If you do, you can actually bring your awareness into your heart, and with practice, it'll start to slow. So just paying attention to the stress response helps to regulate the stress response. If I've noticed, for example, I'm tensed up, maybe you see this quite common, you see someone sit down at their desk, they start the working day, the shoulders start to kind of rise, right? This kind of tension. They might sit there for a while, and at the end of the day, they're like, oh God, When you become more aware, you can actually, you notice when you're doing it, and you just go, oh, just do that, set a bit of self-massage, work it out. So we have these kind of tools within us to re-regulate that stress response.
Does that recognition of when we're feeling stressed get affected by the fact that we're stressed? Because a lot of the time it's a retrospective that people burn out and then go, oh, I must have been stressed. Yeah.
So I think this is something I come across in my work a lot, is that people often didn't recognize just how stressed they were. I think it became so normal, it almost like became the baseline. So I use that sort of analogy like a kettle boiling, where people might come into me and they just say, yeah, I just got like really stressed the other day, or things just it just became too much for me. And someone might say to me something like, it just went from like 0 to 100. And that's the kind of perception. And actually when we take a bit of a history and kind of look at stuff, maybe get a sense of kind of symptoms that they may not have attributed to stress, you almost go, what's more likely is that their baseline had ended up as like 70 out of 100. So they're already at 70 degrees, 80 degrees. That's their kind of resting level. And then it just doesn't take that much before they get to that kind of boiling, and then it's too much. So that's something that people often recognize is the more you start to prioritize regulating your stress response, what often happens is as people start to relax, they start to realize just how stressed they were. Right? It's almost like, God, I didn't know I could feel like this. Wow, and then they relax a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. This often happens for people over weeks and weeks and months potentially. But there is often that realization when they go, wow, I was like really, really stressed. Didn't realize it. Now, some people do realize it, but it's a combination. But I often find that people, they sort of have a partial view of how stressed they are. Like they're aware of some symptoms, but then there's other symptoms of stress that they're just not attributing to stress. They just think it's something else. So sometimes, gastro symptoms, for example, people will be talking about going, I've got kind of IBS, or I've got this, or I've got that, and they're not making the link to the fact that they're really stressed. And so what they might do is that they'll be looking at kind of foods and things that they're eating, which can also, of course, I'm sure if you speak to Dan, also has a relationship. But what I often notice is if you sort of look at it in conjunction with other symptoms, you start to get a bit more of a picture. Yeah. And if you start to say, so like, when does it get worse? And then it's like, oh, yeah, like it's worse Monday to Friday, it kind of goes away at the weekends. And it's like, how are you at the weekends? I'm actually pretty relaxed at the weekends. I kind of do a lot of enjoyable stuff. What happens on Monday? Work. And it's like, oh, So it's kind of things like that to sort of go, interesting how that only happens when you're in the stressed environment. Yeah. Do you think stress will be playing a part? So I think that's just something for people that actually we're often not taught all the different kind of symptoms that we can get. And these tend to worsen if the stress is more chronic, is what you tend to get. Because the kind of chronic and ongoing stress will tend to have a negative effect on the body because it tends to be promotes sort of inflammation in the system.
If someone practices those short-term stress management strategies that you mentioned, are there long-term changes to them that help them to deal with pressure better in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the shorter term, you'll start to feel better. What tends to happen is with a lot of these kind of practices, when you stick with them, there's increasing evidence to show that the brain, because of its neuroplasticity, the nervous system, it tends to sort of essentially improve in its ability to actually regulate stress. So it's a little bit, I'm sure you could probably find an analogy with physical exercise. If I work on, flexibility or improving my strength or whatever, it's going to carry over. And so long as I continue to work on it, it will improve over time. So it's a similar thing. So the benefits will aggregate with continuous practice. Similarly, if you just stop, it's the same thing as like if I go to the gym, I could build up a level of fitness. If I then just stop and go cold turkey, my fitness will probably carry, I'll probably have the benefits for a while, but it'll probably start to taper over time. And it's a sort of a similar thing with this as well. So doing the practices themselves will be beneficial for you just in the more immediate. Continuing to do them will actually improve your resiliency to stress, your ability to kind of regulate stress.
Wasn't there a study on was it monks? Was it Buddhist monks? Where they were showing their regular breathing practices, meditation, had actually meant that they were able to influence their heart rate more effectively. Those.
So I think so. Yeah. I probably have to go look that up again. But the really seasoned meditators, some of these guys who've been doing it for almost like lifetime practices, were apparently able to gain conscious control over physiological systems that we're told we can't have conscious control over, which is quite interesting. So they're able to alter like the body temperature, heart rate, things like that, which normally we sort of do indirectly. Right. Now I think sometimes, like I said earlier, I think with, if my heart is going quite quick, if I bring my awareness to it, that is probably something that you can kind of slow over time. And often it's just that sort of being still, it'll tend to decrease. But I think with those guys, it was pretty amazing what they were able to do. And that was just, they just cultivated that body awareness over, thousands of hours, years and years of dedicated practice. Now, that's an option, but I think for most of us probably kind of living in the world we live, we probably don't have the time to set aside to, doing the monastic lifestyle or whatever it might be. So you tend to find some of the interventions that work really well would be like a breathing practice, because that is one of the physiological systems that we have actually conscious control over. It's what really sets breathing apart, and it's why you see I don't think it's an accident that you see breathing as like a cornerstone, within yoga, within other things like, Tai Chi, Qi Kung, martial arts. A lot of world religions have breathing practices around prayers, things like that. That's not an accident. Okay. I think that my senses for that is that breathing, it's one of these sort of systems in the body that it's automatic, so it runs similarly. Like my heart beats by itself, my digestive system digests by itself, my breathing breathes by itself. But I can't just stop my digestive system. I can't just go stop, or I can't just speed up how quickly I digest food, probably without taking some medication. Right? I can't just kind of go, right? You kind of force it to speed things up. Doesn't really work. But breathing you can. Right? So I'll breathe automatically. My breathing will change in response to stressors, but I can also take conscious control of my breathing, and I can actually, with practice, determine, make a decision for the speed I breathe in and breathe out. I can consciously hold my breath. I could hyperventilate myself if I want to. Right? I can breathe in really slowly, breathe out really slowly. So it's an amazing kind of tool. So it's one of those few systems that, it's part of the autonomic nervous system that essentially works on autopilot, but we can switch to manual when we need to. And that's the great thing, you see. So if I'm under stress, my body is reacting, I'm having a stress response. And I'm able to sort of consciously go, hang on, like, okay, I'm feeling stressed right now, but this is not like a life or death stressor, right? Maybe this is kind of ego stress, it's kind of a threat to like reputation or my sense of how I'm going to be perceived, whatever it might be. What I can do, because I know I'm not literally going to die, I can actually just bring my awareness into my body and I go, oh, my breathing is actually kind of fast right now. I'll consciously start to slow it down. Right? And what will happen is that my system will then actually perceive the slow breathing as me being safe. So this is a really interesting piece. It's a little breath pacemaker in the brain, which they discovered a couple of years ago. It's kind of called the pre-Botzinger complex. I think it's kind of technical term. And what it does is it monitors your breathing. And when you're breathing really fast, it's basically it's kind of going, oh, we're breathing really fast, so we must be under threat or challenge, so I better let the rest of the brain know. And then the brain actually gets a message that goes up that says, maintain the stress response. More adrenaline to the system, more cortisol, more stress hormones. Let's keep everything fired up. If you slow the breathing down, this little breath pacemaker goes, ooh, we're safe. And so it sends messages higher up the chain in the brain, and basically the stress response system gets dialed back, and then you will actually start to experience a sense of calm as things ease off. So there's this interesting thing that there's like a loop, and it's all about like where do you intervene in the loop. And breathing is one of the ways you can get into that loop, and you can actually kind of take control of it. So you're not just at the mercy of the stress response. And that's the physiological part. Yeah. The next part, the other piece, is the psychological. So you've got kind of physiological and psychological. And the way you can think about this is, you could probably use something like a smoke alarm as an analogy. So you think about this, the part that sort of detects the smoke. And then when it sets off, there's the alarm. Okay. What I've been talking about now in terms of regulating the stress response, I'm talking about the alarm. I'm more sort of dialing. How do we dial that alarm down so that it's ringing in proportion to essentially like the threat, and actually when the it doesn't sort of overtake us. The next bit is actually looking at that smoke detector piece and going, does it go off too readily? Does it perceive a lot of things as kind of threat that isn't threat? And that's the kind of psychological piece. Or does it sort of overestimate the threat, right? So it's a little bit like a lot of, like a smoke alarm. If it kicks off every time you're cooking, it's not really that helpful, You want it to be able to kind of differentiate from, kind of cooking versus like a proper fire. And it's that kind of idea. And that's, I think, where the psychological comes in. That's more about sort of the perception that we take, like how do you actually perceive what's going on in terms of the consequences, in terms of our ability to cope. All of that is in that kind of psychological space.
Does having those stress coping strategies presumably improve your perception of your ability to deal with the pressure that causes the stress?
Yeah, absolutely.
It comes full circle.
Yeah, they feed each other. That's the really interesting thing. So they each one strengthens the other. Is what's really nice. So if I can actually moderate my stress response, then the threat in itself doesn't seem as big, because actually I know it can't really overwhelm me. because I've got a lot more influence over it. Also, though, if I actually are reframing things in a more kind of, well, for want of a better word, like let's say in a more proportionate way, right? I'm less likely to have that stress response in the first place. It's not going to be as high because I'm going to go, oh, actually, it's not that big a deal. Right? So the two of them will work together, and it not being that big a deal means that the stress response that they then have to regulate isn't as high. So I can regulate that even more quickly, right? Which feeds back into my perception and my ability to cope. So it becomes like a kind of virtuous circle if you work both parts. Yeah?